to the world. Subscribe now to the Hot 97 YouTube channel. It's Ebro in the Morning with Laura Stiles and Rosenberg.
Ebro in the Morning, Laura Stiles, Rosenberg, welcoming to the program Jacquelyn Martell. She's the Executive Director of Education Reform Now, New York. Jackie, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. Hi.
Yes. Now, Jackie is not only an activist and an executive director here, but also I have a list of things here that I want to run through just so the audience can kind of get up to the time on what's happening with education reform here locally in New York. Okay.
Okay.
Can you explain to us what Democrats for Education Reform and Education Reform Now actually is? It's being coined as DFER, DFER.
Yeah, DFER New York. So we're an organization, a nonprofit organization that uses evidence-based policies to really create reform for equity for children across the United States. We currently are in 8 different states. I oversee all of New York's activities. And what we do is we advocate for the most marginalized students and families in the district around education issues at large. We're for high quality, high standards, education equity, which is school choice. And we provide policy reform. We also do legislative reform. And we also work to support elected officials and candidates who are going to really push the needle and fight for kids in Albany.
So you brought up school choice, which is always a hot button topic and has been framed in the last couple of years, has been reframed because I think people have learned that a lot of Black and brown families are choosing what schools they go to and with the support of charter schools. But when you started hearing about school choice, many people were afraid that public school kids in the city, mostly Black and brown, were going to be left behind by this school choice thing. Can you explain a little bit more about what's actually happening with school choice so people who may not have kids in school and just kind of hear about it secondhand can understand what's happening?
Yeah, sure. So I think school choice, when we talk about school choice, just to be clear, we're talking about parents' right to choose the right education system or modality for their child, whether that be private school, traditional public school, or charter schools, which are actually public schools. And charter schools are, I want to be clear, public schools that are independently run. Right now, the ecosystem for charter schools in New York, we have about 275 charter schools in New York City, 141,000 of students in the charter school system here, which is about 15% of the New York City public system at large. And, you get a lot of, it's interesting to me how we coin school choice. When we talk about school choice for wealthy, affluent families here in New York, I don't ever get any pushback. It's only when we talk about school choice for families in some of the most marginalized districts, the economically disadvantaged districts throughout the city, where I get a lot of pushback from folks about what school choice means. And charter schools, like I said, they're public schools. They're publicly funded for the most part. Their funding model is a bit different from traditional public schools. But they're lottery schools, and we see oftentimes that most charter schools, about 98% of charter schools in New York City, actually serve as Black and brown students.
So, and why do you think that is? I have my own thoughts, but I'd love to hear from you. Why do you think most Black and brown communities push back against the idea of school choice?
Well, actually, I don't find that. I'm just going to clarify that too. A lot of Black and brown families actually don't push back against school choice. We actually just commissioned this huge poll in which we polled thousands of downstate parents, Democrats particularly, and we found that over 64% of parents actually are for school choice and for charter school expansion. Right now in the city and the state of New York, we have a moratorium here, so we can't grow. But to your earlier point too, why we see a lot of charter schools in economically disadvantaged areas is because the school districts there are not performing at level. You have some districts across the city of New York in which you have 25% of students coming out of the public school, traditional public school system, being able to read and write on grade level. That's actually considered quite high, which is sad. If you go upstate,
high on a national level, high on a state level,
high on a state level, in the state, and when you go upstate, it's even more dire. So when you go to districts like Buffalo or Rochester, you have single digit proficiencies in some of these districts, which is, in my opinion, is a human rights crisis. We also just saw some data that came out in which 62% of students that are going into the CUNY system, so our city university system here, which are primarily students coming out of the traditional public school system, they actually have to take remedial classes because they're not ready for college level courses. And so, it's interesting. I grew up in New York City public schools my whole life, from K through 12. And I had to travel an hour and a half to go to a high school in Manhattan. I lived in the Bronx. I was able to get into this school called the Beacon High School. I had to travel an hour and a half just to go to a high quality school. And when I say high quality, I'm talking about being able to, in this case, come out with basic skills. We're not even talking about some other, opportunities for innovation within education. Right now, the fight is really, are we educating our kids? We're seeing extreme levels of learning loss after the pandemic. And we're not even talking about the mental health issues that we've seen coming out of the pandemic. And right now, we feel as if our legislature really needs to act to improve these. You have school districts that have been failing generation upon generation. There's a district, and it's interesting because I live in Harlem right now, in CSD, Community School District 5, 65% of parents are opting to put their children into charter schools. 38% of Black parents in New York City have their children enrolled in kindergarten. So 38% of Black students are charter students are in kindergarten here. We see Black and brown parents want more school choice, want more options, because the option is, do I send my child to the zone school that has been failing perhaps my generation, the generation before me, or do I choose to give my child the opportunity to thrive and advance? I'm not saying all charter schools are perfect, and charter schools are not a conglomerate, right? I think the cool thing about charter schools that often gets mixed, and charter schools are so politicized, is that there's opportunity to innovate when it comes to different types of curriculum models, when it comes to different types of activities. Charter schools are not necessarily, they're independently run, and they're very, very heavily authorized. We have two strong authorizers in the state of New York, the Board of Regents and SUNY. And if charter schools are not operating at a high standard, they get shut down. And that doesn't happen in traditional public
We've had a number of educators on our program throughout the years that have been pro school choice, and we've talked through this. Much of the indictment of the innovation, which you've brought up multiple times, falls on the school board and the teachers union, according to people we've had on the program in the past. Is that correct?
What do you mean exactly by that? I want to make sure before I
Meaning answer. the lack of innovation, the ability to cater to what's needed to the students, the ability to change and keep up with times. These things are caught up in bureaucracy of the school boards and many times the teachers union.
Got it.
Now, there's been other indictments of people we've had on the program in the past. I don't need to get into those because it gets into, racism and white supremacy and the teachers union and white women not caring and blah, 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 blah. So I don't need to do that. But how much of it is the lack of innovation, which you pointed out several times, tied to the school board and the teachers unions?
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head. I think it is heavily tied to bureaucracy. And I would say the teachers union. And let me caveat that in saying I'm pro-union. Before I actually came into the ed reform space, I was a labor organizer for 32BJ SCIU, which is the largest service workers union in New York. And I worked in JFK Airport. Pro-union. My mom was a nurse, 1199. I think coming into the education space, I was startled. And what kept me here was seeing that lack of innovation and seeing it so heavily politicized. It is not about children. It is not about families. It is about the unions making sure that they get their message across and that they don't lose any of their workforce. And teachers, I want to be clear.
And they don't lose their money.
Correct, right? And so right now, we work with a lot of elected officials who, to be honest, standing up for children, right, it's a hard thing to do in this legislature. Our Governor Hochul, I do want to give her a shout out in this last executive budget, in which is still being negotiated in Albany right now. She actually called for an expansion of charter schools. So there's a moratorium here in the state. But I do think, to your point, a lot of it is stifled. This innovation is stifled in this bureaucracy. You know, charter schools, there's a lot of talk about what we in New York City in particular around co-location. You know, there's limited real estate. I don't know if you grew up in New York City, you're kind of used to this, where you got
They got multiple schools in one school.
4 schools in one building. And a lot of pushback that I get is that when you go to the traditional public school on the first floor, the facilities, you know, sometimes they're not on par, you know, and then you go to the second floor where there's a charter school and you see awesome technology being used. You see beautiful murals, you know, and a part of that is heavily tied to bureaucracy. You know, traditional public schools have to operate under this procurement process, this bureaucratic process, and sometimes it stifles growth in many ways. And so instead of blaming the charter schools, which the unions, I think, often do, and a lot of these anti-charter advocacy groups do, they blame the charter schools. You know, let's talk about the system at large, right? We shouldn't take resources away from kids when they're working because your system is not working properly. So I think a lot of it
well,
is
and furthermore, while we try to, this is the part where it irritates me. Because what sort of psychological and emotional damage is going on to the kids who are in the bad school, right? Y'all are in the same building. You didn't get into the charter school for whatever reason. Y'all in the same building, and now kids are showing up, and you go to the raggedy school. Somebody else goes to the nice school. Y'all in the same building in the same city, and that sort of classism, elitism that's being developed, which we already have. I mean, it's a part of the fabric of our society, but we're reinforcing it as adults when we allow this to continue on and not finding solutions that benefit the children. And we're so caught up in our bureaucracy.
I
have a quick question.
Okay.
Are charter schools, how are they funded? Are they independently funded?
Yeah, so most of their funding actually comes from state and federal and state funding, but we are not on parity with traditional public schools. So they have to subsidize the lack of funding that they're getting with you know, private funding or independent funding. So the funding is mainly federal and state, similar to traditional public schools. It's just not on parity to traditional public schools. So to make up for that deficit, charter schools have to raise money independently.
And I guess the next question I have for you, Jacquelyn Martell, representing, and you say it's pronounced DFER or DFER?
Can I just go back to one thing that you said though, Ebro, really quickly about the
of course.
You know, I think that's such a good point. You know, is the psychological damage that this does do to children, and we often have to keep that centered. I talk about my story. I grew up and I went to public school my entire life. In the same household I lived in, my brother was zoned to the school in our neighborhood district, which was at that time in the northeast section of the Bronx. Metal detectors, police officers, heavy gang violence. And it caused my brother a lot of psychological damage that impacted his trajectory. So you have people within the same household here in New York who experience that same have and have nots kind of mentality. And I think it's detrimental. And we see this primarily in Black and brown communities. We don't see this in affluent white communities because their school districts are heavily funded. I will say too, you know, just thinking about this from a logical standpoint, right? Because a lot of times people want to talk about logic. You know, New York City, we have the highest per pupil spending in all of the country. I think right now we're at $38,000 per student to educate a student is needed. We have full funding now, full funding in New York State, which is precedented. And it's amazing. But why are we continuing to funnel money into a system that is not working? And where is this money going is the question. When you have students that are unable to come out with basic math skills, basic reading and writing skills, what trajectory, what path to success do they really have? And so I always say, you know, you can attack the charter schools, which is again about 15% of the New York City school system, or you can actually work to reform and reallocate those dollars in a way so that all the schools have adequate facilities, have the proper workforce, are able to implement interventions and innovative systems that can service, you know, a child at large and their family. Because we see when we have great schools in communities thrive at large. So it's a great point.
You're watching the proposed New York City budget, I'm sure, right, Jackie?
Yep, I'm in Albany all the time. I'm watching
What
it.
are your thoughts on Eric Adams' proposed cuts to public school funding, libraries, et cetera, et cetera?
We're not for cuts to goods and services such as public libraries, public goods at all. Our mayor, we're actually in conversations with his office. There's a lot of things that we know need to be funded a little bit more heavily, particularly around ELL services, for English language learners. Right now, we're working on an initiative to actually help to provide services to migrant students in the city. We see an influx of migrant students, so we're working with his office. I think, when we think about education cuts and reallocations to certain funds, we saw a beef up in the police funding and all of that. We're not for any cuts to education and for reallocations of sorts. Anything that's taken away from kids, DFER is not for that.
Do you understand the thought process? Can you give us any insight? If you don't, that's fine. But is there any insight other than it just being evil? Because us as outsiders will be like, why would you cut that? Like, what's wrong with you? And why? And it sounds like you're preparing kids for the prison pipeline more than you're preparing them for success when you start cutting education to add it. So you're just assuming that you're going to have more problems. What are we doing here?
Yeah, I think that, there's also been allocations to like workforce development programs. I think there's like this shift in this legislature, which I think is not necessarily miss in any way, in which we're seeing more money actually put into programs for workforce development as opposed to interventions at the K through 12 level per se, which is not necessarily the wrong thing. I think that you do see, though, a lot of those programs are actually underutilized and overfunded. I'm not going to speak too much about the city budget. Most of the stuff that we do is actually on the state level. So a lot of the education policies, to be quite frank, that impact schools at large happen on the state level. And so we're working with our governor and our state legislature to make sure that we're able to get this budget passed. A lot of it is being held up, as you know, due to bail reform and housing, which are actually very key issues that I think impact education has high impact on. And so I think the conversation amongst leadership now, particularly in Albany and downstate with our mayor, needs to be heavily focused on education and interventions that can prevent, crime rising, the school prison pipeline.
Because school productivity is directly tied to, or lack thereof, is directly tied to what kids decide to do with their lives.
100%.
And mischief and bad decisions, emotional instability, feeling like they're being, because that's what it takes for students. Students and young people need to feel loved, appreciated, and like they matter. So oftentimes the kids that do feel that way are the ones least likely to go out and make some of these decisions that change the trajectory of their life in a negative way.
100%, and there's a lot of other education policies that we're actually advocating for this legislative session. One of them being high impact tutoring, which is the top intervention in mitigating learning loss. We've seen high levels of learning loss due to the pandemic. Governor Hochul, she earmarked about $250 million in her executive budget for high impact tutoring. We've seen this scaled out in other states in which we have DFER chapters, including Colorado, Louisiana, and DC, which isn't a state, but we've seen high impact tutoring really work. We want to work with this administration to provide high impact tutoring to all students across the state, because we know that it works. And actually, it was removed from both of the one house budgets. So on the Assembly and the Senate side, it was not included because it was tied to what we call foundation aid here in the state. And so we're advocating for high impact tutoring to be implemented at all schools, traditional public schools, charter public schools, to help these kids get back on track, because what we're seeing is extreme levels of learning loss. And to your point, when you get off track, and it's as early as like the third grade is when we don't have those interventions as early as the third grade, it has adverse impacts on a child's livelihood. And so we need to really work to have these interventions implemented earlier. Another thing that we're working on too, and the thing I love about charter schools in particular is when I talk about innovation, we talk about teacher pipeline. We need to have more schools that are led by leaders of color. Research shows that Black and brown students thrive when they are instructed by leaders of color. A lot of our charter schools, a lot of our networks are able to do this, have been able to do this successfully. We want to work to lift the cap. Right now, as I mentioned, there's a moratorium. We cannot open any more charter schools because of politics and this arbitrary cap. But we want to be able to open more charter schools to help get more leaders of color, particularly running schools, out there. DFER right now is working with Equitable Facilities Fund and the New York Charter Schools Association, and Assembly Member Brian Cunningham in Brooklyn. We just introduced a bill in which we're asking for the state to earmark public dollars to create a low revolving loan fund. We then would come and get that match 3 times more through philanthropic endeavors. So you'll essentially take $30 million investment on the state level, and we'd be able to turnkey that to a $300 million revolving loan fund to help leaders of color be able to operate schools on the facilities level. So really excited.
And Jackie,
yeah,
we should gather from this conversation that you are pro charter school.
Yes.
Heavily.
Yes.
And that without being, and it sounds like you're dodging the political aspect of it a little bit, whereas being pro charter school, you clearly we have lost faith in our ability for public schools to meet the needs of students, Black and brown specifically, and low income.
I would say I'm pro charter. Yes, our organization is pro charter, but I'm pro parental choice. So whatever school works for said parent, that is what we are for. And we're for accountability and high standards across all of these schools. So you have parents, I know parents, I have a sibling like this. One of her children goes to charter schools. The other goes to traditional public schools. We have advocates who have sent their kids to traditional public schools and then charter schools and then back to traditional public schools because, it just worked for them. And so we're for high standards and high quality for all schools. But I also am, as the leader of this organization, for high standards. And, I think that we shouldn't water down standards when it comes to Black and brown kids. And we should really be able to take a step back and look at what's working and innovate based on that. Spending and funneling $38,000 per student and coming out with failing results.
Bad results, right.
It doesn't make sense. We rank New York, so we have the highest per pupil spending in the country, but guess where we rank up nationally when it comes to results? Can you guess?
I'm going with 35th.
47th. We are 47th when it comes to results.
That is terrible.
Like what system? And the thing I love about that's terrible. The thing I love about like education reform and why I left the union world and the labor world to come into education is because we should be able to be talking about some more innovative things when it comes to our families, particularly our Black and brown families, the kids that need it the most. 47 in New York City, New York State, to me is embarrassing. So.
No, it's sad. That's terrible. I didn't know it was that low. And
Yeah.
so let me reframe it. What we know is that you're pro charter schools and you're also pro families having choice ultimately because it is tough I'm just trying to gather this for the audience so that they have something to pay attention to here. The ability to hold a public school accountable for low performance sounds impossible versus a charter school, which is held to a higher standard. Is that making sense?
100%. Like I said, charter schools have to go through we have a very rigorous authorization process in New York, one of the most rigorous in all of the nation. And so charter schools, if they are not meeting standards, they shut down. They get shut down.
Period. Versus a public school gets all types of, loopholes and leeways is what it sounds like.
Yeah, they're held to standards as well, right? But they don't shut down. They won't get shut down. And it depends on each administration on how they kind of authorize over it. But yeah, charter schools are held to very high standards. And I think
and Jackie, for parents, families listening right now, what kind of action item do you have for them? What should they be paying attention to? What should they follow on Instagram, social media, so they could stay up to the time here? Or is there some sort of action specifically that we need the public to do?
Yeah, right now, I would say you can go visit our website, DFER.org. And we have some direct action items right now in this budget, during this budget crisis, where we are at risk of really losing a lot of resources when it comes to education. a lot of the policies when it comes to education happen on the state level. And so it's very important for you to get involved in, voting for your local elected officials from the assembly level to the state senate. And you can reach out to your local elected officials and say that you want more school choice, and that you want the cap lifted in New York State. And you can visit our website, as I mentioned, and we have direct action that you can take, it takes a few seconds.
There you go. Jacquelyn Martell representing DFER. Go look for them.
Thank you, Ebro.
Thank you very much for your time
Thanks,
today.
Jackie.